Who is Jesus? Have you found yourself asking this question? Well, so did many in Jesus' midst, from his disciples to the very governor who called for his crucifixion. This Holy Week, we invite you to walk in the footsteps of Jesus, to relive some of the scenes of his journey to the cross, to ask the kinds of questions that those around him asked, to see how Jesus dismantled those false expectations, and as we go, to get a fresh sense of who Jesus is and what this means for all of us. At this point in the journey, it is the break of dawn on Friday morning. Jesus has had the Last Supper with his disciples. He's prayed at the Garden Gethsemane. He has stood before the Sanhedrin, the religious authorities. And in our passage today, we see Jesus standing before Pontius Pilate, the head of the government of the day. In Mark chapter 15, verse 1, it says, "Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin, they made their plans. So they bound Jesus, they led him away, and handed him over to Pilate." Now, Jerusalem was under Roman occupation at the time. The emperor, the king as it were, was Caesar, and his representative on the ground was Pontius Pilate. And so here in the scene, we see Jesus standing before the most powerful political leader of the day. I wonder, what does power look like to you? The world might say power comes in the form of how many followers you have on Instagram, the level of authority you have in the workplace, or the size of your military budget. And while power is not wrong in and of itself, the Sanhedrin and Pilate are essentially misusing their power to send Jesus to the cross. And as people with power, I wonder what they were expecting Jesus to be like. You see, the Sanhedrin were the highest Jewish council. They presided over all Jewish law and decided what was right and what was wrong according to the religious laws at the time. And following last night's trial, they found Jesus guilty of blasphemy against God. They thought, who is this man to say that he can forgive sins? Only God can. But the problem was, as religious leaders only, they didn't have the authority to execute anyone. So even though they had an issue with Jesus, they needed higher authority from the emperor to be able to punish him. And so here's where Pilate comes in. They need to convince Pilate that Jesus has committed an offense not just against the religious authorities, but against the government, against Roman law. And so they take Jesus' claim that he's a Jewish Messiah, and then very cunningly they twist it to say that Jesus claims he's the king of the Jews. In verse 2, Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now, this accusation from the Sanhedrin put Pilate in a tight spot. You see, it meant Pilate would have to take Jesus seriously as a potential political threat. And it's not surprising that he would. Jesus had immense influence, and he had a following of people who, just a few days ago on Palm Sunday, actually wanted to crown him king. One could say that Jesus was the original influencer. And yet, throughout history, we read about people who declared themselves king. In 1976, in Central Africa, Emperor Bokassa, he put on a lavish coronation ceremony for himself. History tells us his monarchy was short-lived. Closer to home in China, all throughout the 20th century, there were repeated attempts by individuals who self-proclaimed themselves Chinese emperors. None of them was successful. And even now, we see the exertion of power in Europe at the expense of devastating loss. And yet, when faced with this question, and in fact, in his entire time before Pilate, Jesus doesn't say yes or no. The only thing he says is simply, "You have said so." Why does Jesus respond this way? Why is he quiet in the face of such injustice? I think Jesus doesn't defend himself because he knows who he truly is. His security comes from his identity, his power not in exerting himself over others, but in restraining himself for the sake of others. And so when Pilate asked him again, "Aren't you going to answer?" it says Jesus made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. I wonder if you're wrestling with anything in your life right now and a defense is on the tip of your tongue. I know it's easy for me to feel this way. When something is said against me, I so often feel the need to defend myself. To Pilate, having power meant protecting himself and preserving his power, and so he must have expected the same of Jesus. But Jesus gave of himself and gave up his power, and instead held his power with an open hand. Is this what a true king really looks like? Jesus subverts our expectations and turns power on its head. It tells us in verse 16 that the soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, and on the surface, this was the perfect scene for a coronation ceremony. They put a purple robe on him, they set a crown of thorns on him, and then they held up a sign, "The King of the Jews." What normally happens in these kinds of coronation services is people would then celebrate the newly installed king. Long live the king. And yet with Jesus, his true kingship and authority was found not just in the king's life, but in the fact that he was willing to lay down his life. It was found in the king's death. Pilate asked, "Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" The crowd said, "Crucify him." "What crime has he committed?" Pilate asked. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." And the religious authorities, they stirred up the crowd to ask for Barabbas to be released instead. You know, in other parts of scripture, it tells us Barabbas was a notorious prisoner, Matthew 27:16. He was a rebel against the Roman government, Luke 23:19. It's ironic because while Jesus is being crucified for being a potential political threat, Barabbas was actually a real political threat. And yet, in spite of Barabbas' background, it was here in the palace that King Jesus gave his life for him. Pilate used his power to redirect the decision to the crowd. The crowd used their power to release Barabbas instead. But Jesus, he restrains his power and he gives up his life for Barabbas, the innocent in place of the guilty. Jesus doesn't tolerate misuse of power. He stands up against injustice when he needs to. But here in this case, for the joy set before him, for the sake of me and you, Jesus gave up his power and endured the cross. Maybe today you're feeling powerless to change the world around you. Or maybe you resonate with one of the characters in Mark chapter 15, conflicted like Pilate, angry like the crowd, or guilty like Barabbas. Maybe you feel alone in your suffering like Jesus. Jesus set his sights on paradise, and his invitation is for all of us. The promise for you is that Jesus is present in your pain. He promises a different kind of power, one that says, "I will lay down my life for yours," and in that, with Jesus, be raised to new life. On Palm Sunday, the crowd said, "Crown him." Before Pilate, the crowd said, "Crucify him." But the message of the cross is consistent. Jesus simply says, "Come." Would we come to Jesus and know the power of the resurrected Jesus in our lives today?